Very little drivers have had as successful of a junior Formula career and karting career like Oscar Piastri. One of the newer drivers to our Formula grid that has already won over many people and shown true pace in a car and already taking a sprint victory within his short 1.5 year career. The driver hasn't had many weaknesses throughout his career. In both F2, F3, and in karting, he was pretty much unbeatable and has been compared to the likes of Charles Leclerc, George Russell, Max Verstappen, and all their early careers. As he continues in Formula 1, he's constantly improving, but there's one problem that's been persistent from the start of 2023. That issue for Oscar Piastri is tire degradation. Before getting into the bigger part of the video, I wanted to thank you guys for the support on the channel. We're almost at 34,000. Truly means the world having you guys backing me up for this channel, and the support you guys show is incredible. So thank you so much. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. It'd mean a lot to me. Let's start the Oscar Piastri driving style video. Oscar Piastri was automatically put in a very hard car to drive, which is the McLaren car. It requires a certain driving style, and some drivers have never ended up adapting to that driving style correctly. Daniel Ricciardo is your perfect example, and many before him have struggled with the McLaren because these inherent traits of it being on a knife's edge has been a constant problem for that car. So when Oscar Piastri was put into the car, the first thing he said was that he was unfazed at all by the car, and he can definitely drive this as fast as he wants to. That was very apparent in the beginning. He was showing true pace in Jeddah in 2023, and throughout the season he was showing that he is a strong competitor to Lando Norris, who we all see as a star in Formula 1. In 2024 he still continues to show this pace, but yet again there still is that problem. And Piastri defines his driving style in a certain way and compares himself to a certain legend. He explains his strengths as being adaptable to a car, and that is shown. From F2 to F1, he automatically adapted to the McLaren, and obviously, ignorance is bliss. If you drive one Formula 1 car, which is the McLaren, you'll get used to that style and you can drive it. Going from a different car, it is a bit difficult, and while that isn't an excuse for Daniel Ricciardo, it is one of the problems that he had. He knew how to drive other cars, but when going into the McLaren, the problems that were in that McLaren gave him a much harder time because of what he knew from before. He did say getting to grips with the new floor regulations and how the downforce levels are with these cars in comparison to what he drove in Formula 2 is much more different, but as you can see, he quickly adapted to that. He explains his driving style to Alain Prost, pretty close in the similarities as to how they drive. The reason why he said he's close to Prost is I think with the amount of downforce we have in cars these days, I think you have to drive them quite straight. What he means by this is pretty much smooth. You have to be very smart with the way that you feel out the car and the inputs you put into the car with the gas and the brake and how you turn the steering wheel has to be very light and sensitive. Alain Prost was known as the professor while driving. He drove in a smooth, relaxed style behind the wheel, deliberately modeling himself from other personal heroes like Jackie Stewart and Jim Clark. These were all drivers that drove in a very smooth style. Another one that can be explained in this way is Jenson Button. And there aren't many drivers that could drive in this type of way to pull so much performance out of the car. Inputs in the brake and gas are very important here, and how you turn the steering wheel going into corners is also very important. Oscar Piastri does prefer a little bit of oversteer to understeer while driving the car. Most drivers do. But a well-balanced car for Oscar is pretty much what he prefers. Lando is kind of the same in that way. That's why they're not too far off of each other. He even talks about with these new cars and the downforce levels, how you have to be with the tires. Mentioning that, and with the tires we have as well, they just don't like being sideways, so you always have to adapt to what you've got around you. And this is an important thing to note when talking about the style and tire degradation that's been kind of hindering Oscar Piastri. One of the most notable performances Oscar had in 2023 was Qatar. He ended up getting the sprint win and got P2 by the end of the race. There was one extreme rule set in place at Qatar that really helped out Oscar Piastri. If you guys don't remember what that rule was, the Qatar Grand Prix was extremely hot and tires were degrading at a crazy rate. So this is one of the only races where you could have a set limit to the tires and how much laps you could be driven on them. The race was a mandatory 3-stop, and drivers pretty much were just pushing full out the whole entire time because the tires were made to last at least for that amount of laps. The strategy wasn't differentiated that much because they had to do a certain amount of laps, so most drivers were just driving at their full pace the full time, which isn't a usual in Formula 1. This gave Oscar the advantage and gave him P2, but Lando was behind in P3, and honestly, if McLaren was to let them fight, Lando would have taken the P2 over Oscar and maybe even caught Max in that race. The race right after that was the worst race that Oscar's probably had in his career so far in Formula 1, and that was the US Grand Prix. Kota is another track that has really high tire degradation, and while he did end up DNFing in the race due to a problem, his pace wasn't there at all competitive to Lando. That was because of tire degradation, how he had to handle that tire degradation, and the car's overall characteristics. Kota does tend to have some long, slow speed corners, which has always been a huge issue for the McLaren, but Lando was really good on the car here, ended up finishing P3, which ended up turning to a P2 because of the DNF for Lewis Hamilton, but the two of them weren't competitive at all throughout this race. It was a Lando-dominated race. As we look onto the current times, the actual standings themselves, Oscar and Lando are not far off, and Oscar's best performance came from Saudi Arabia, where tire degradation wasn't a thing. Now, while Lando's finishing position doesn't really show the true story because of differentiating tire strategies, because of a safety car that came out earlier in the race, and Piastri actually ended up taking the advantage there, the two of them weren't far off at all, but Piastri was the better driver out of the two of them on that race weekend, that's a for sure. In Bahrain, he was about 8 seconds off of Lando, which isn't that bad on a track with a lot of thermal degradation. We go into Australia, and this is where we start to see, yet again, that tire deg problem come for Oscar Piastri. In the beginning stints, they were pretty much trading times. There wasn't much to it, but as we get to the first pit stop, we can see that Piastri is about 5/10 slower to Norris. And this is where we always end up seeing the problem. It's when we get towards the end of the pit stops or towards the end of the race where Norris starts to pick up the pace and Piastri starts falling behind because of too much tire usage. Looking at the second stint, you can see that Norris is consistently up 5/10 pretty much on Piastri here. And while there are some certain outliers, the gap is always around 5, 6 to 7/10, which is a pretty huge difference in race pace. Same thing shown in the third stint, it's a continuous chart. And when we look at the Japan 2024 Grand Prix, it's the same thing. Norris does have an advantage here even in the beginning of the race, but due to traffic, it's hard to really gauge how far off Piastri was here or not. In the middle stint, it was kind of the same story. Norris had the advantage. Piastri wasn't able to actually catch Fernando Alonso on hard tires that were supposed to be the more advantageous tires in this Grand Prix over the mediums because of tire degradation. And towards the end of the race, Lando still had that supreme pace and was a whole second up on Piastri at the end when it came to lap times at the very last lap. Piastri did finish with the fastest lap here, but he did have a lot of tire deg, and Lando was the more consistent driver here. In 2023, it was the same issue, but he has improved upon this tire degradation. It's not just all negative, that's for sure. When speaking about this driver, it's really hard to find negatives in this driving style. It's just a little bit of overdriving that's really getting to him. He does have those smooth inputs, he still drives extremely well, and Oscar Piastri is still a major talent, gaining so much more experience in our sport. It takes time to adapt to these tires. The actual true pace in qualifying, he's never far off of Lando Norris, and if anything, is maybe even slightly faster than Lando on certain tracks. He's definitely a legend in the making to me. I really think Oscar's got a great career here in Formula 1, but learning when to go hard and when not to is just through experience. Lando Norris is obviously the more experienced driver in this case, and Lando has a lot of experience at taking care of his tires through his whole entire McLaren stint. He's way more adaptable to this weird driving style you have to have with the McLaren, and he talks about it being a subconscious thought all the time when driving the car, saying it's on his mind all the time how he has to take the car into certain corners, when he has to brake, and where he has to have that tire degradation, which is something that Oscar is going to have to adapt to. It's far from over for Oscar, and as I said, experience is really where he's going to gain the most time throughout his career. Oscar Piastri still has so many years in our sport, and by the end of 2024, he'll probably get down on this problem, but it's worth noting that it is a reoccurring problem for him that I do think he's going to get on top of by the end of the year. What are your thoughts on Oscar Piastri? I have a lot of love for the guy. I think he's a great personality. I think he's also an insanely talented driver. that is a little bit more down to the McLaren driving style and how he's got to adapt to the car than Oscar himself. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Please leave a like, subscribe, it'd mean the world, and peace.